Policy Simulator. My name is Sarah Spengeman, and I'm the Deputy Director of Communications here at Energy Innovation. I know we've worked with a lot of you on the call, and many of you are really familiar with our work, but if you're new to EI is a nonpartisan climate policy think tank. We work in the United States and across the world to design and implement the most effective decarbonization policies. In a minute, I'm going to pass it to Robbie Orvis, who is our Director of Energy Policy Design, who will be doing the demo today. And he is also joined by Senior Policy Analyst Megan Mahajan. But before we get started, a few housekeeping items. Everyone is on mute throughout the presentation, but we do have a Q&A box, and you can ask your questions throughout the presentation, and we'll address them at the end. We also have the ability for you to upvote questions. So that's a really efficient way for us to make sure that we answer the questions that most people have. So if you see a question that you also are interested in hearing the answer to, please vote it up. And then we will get to those questions. We'll also have a couple of polling questions open up. And as those open up, go ahead and make your choice. And if you don't see it, don't worry about it. It's just really a way to engage folks. We know that during this year, you all have been on a lot of Zoom calls and webinars, so we want to make it a little bit interactive. And did want to let everyone know that this is being recorded, and we will provide the recording to everyone afterwards. So without further ado, I am now going to pass it over to Robbie.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. Just a quick note, in addition to what Sarah mentioned, the slides from this presentation will also be available on request. So don't worry about writing everything down or taking screenshots. We're happy to make this information available after the presentation. So with that, I'm going to get started. I know a lot of folks on the call are probably already familiar with this tool. But I am going to run through some introductory material again before we jump into some of the new features and then into the web tool itself to kind of look at what those new features look like and what a 1.5-degree scenario for the US looks like. So as some background, the Energy Policy Simulator helps policymakers understand the impacts of energy and environmental policies, to find the best way to meet climate, financial, and other goals, and to make policy decisions that are unbiased and data supported. We have developed many of these models so far. This project began with development of the China and US models, and since then has grown to cover about a dozen different international regions, as well as several subnational regions, including California and Virginia, which we just launched this week. And we will be producing many more state-level versions in the US in a partnership with Rocky Mountain Institute in the coming months. So the idea behind the Energy Policy Simulator is that there are many different policies that can affect energy use and emissions. And the tool is designed to help us sort through those many different policy options to figure out how they work together to reduce emissions. The EPS is a bit of a hybrid model. So for example, we take information and outputs and inputs from top-down models. This might be something like the type of model that forecasts population and GDP per capita and uses that information to project energy demand using things like elasticities. They might estimate fuel prices or imports and exports of fuels. So we take some information from those types of models, for example, those elasticities or those fuel prices, and feed them into the Energy Policy Simulator. We also take inputs and results from bottom-up models. These might be things like a stock turnover model. Some of you may have heard of LEAP. That's one good example that tracks the stocks, sales, and retirements of building equipment. And from those models, we might take things like final energy demand, technology costs, technology efficiencies. In the US national model, a lot of our data comes from the US Energy Information Administration, where we're taking service or energy demand. For example, in the building sector, we take estimates of energy demand by end use and fuel. And in transportation, where we take service demand, for example, passenger miles or freight ton miles, and feed that into the Energy Policy Simulator in our BAU case. I want to just quickly walk through an example calculation flow to help explain how the simulator is working behind the scenes. So for example, we might start with data like annual travel demand, passenger miles, for example, from the Energy Information Administration. And then we might have data on how far vehicles travel in a year on average, and how many vehicles are retiring, or the average age of vehicles in the vehicle fleet. And with these three sets of input data, we can estimate the number of new vehicles that are needed or new vehicles that are purchased in a given year in the model run. We then take information on vehicle prices and vehicle operating costs, for example, maintenance costs of vehicles. And we can use that information to figure out which types of new vehicles are purchased, for example, electric vehicles, gasoline vehicles, hybrids, etc. This is done through a form of optimization in the model to minimize the cost of new vehicles that are purchased. There's also endogenous learning in the EPS. This refers to the fact that prices for technologies will decline in future model years based on deployment of those technologies in earlier years. The EPS does this based on global deployment of technologies and the extent to which policies in the model are altering global deployment of certain technologies. And it applies to technologies outside of just the transportation sector, for example, solar panels, onshore and offshore wind, and carbon capture and sequestration. Once we know the amount and types of new vehicles that are purchased, we can read in information on fuel efficiency to estimate the new vehicle and stock efficiency. And if we know stock efficiency, we can then use emissions factors and the annual travel demand data and vehicles to estimate vehicle emissions. This is a very simplified example of how we might estimate vehicle emissions in the business as usual case, but then we probably want to start layering on policies. So for example, we might add on an EV subsidy. An EV subsidy would affect vehicle prices by making electric vehicles cheaper. That would result in more electric vehicles being purchased in earlier years in the model run. And that in turn, through endogenous learning, would drive down vehicle prices even further in later years, even when they're unsubsidized, which would grow vehicle sales of EVs in later model years. We may also want to add a fuel economy standard. That would do a few things. So for starters, it would obviously affect the fuel efficiency of newly sold vehicles, which would in turn affect the stock efficiency. It would change operating costs. We know that vehicles that are more efficient are a little bit cheaper to operate because they don't require as much fuel to go the same distance. And that in turn would affect the amount of annual vehicle distance traveled, because when cars are cheaper to drive, some people end up driving them more. Maybe a family would end up taking a summer trip that they otherwise wouldn't have, et cetera. That would all flow through this transportation sector module here to change the types of new vehicles that are purchased and ultimately vehicle emissions. Lastly, we might put on transportation demand management or mode shifting policy. This would affect the annual travel demand and then flow through here to reduce the number of new passenger cars needed, for example, and the numbers of new cars purchased. So this is one simplified example of one sector in the model. There are many sectors in the model. The three main demand sectors are the transportation, buildings, and industry sector, which includes agriculture and water and waste. Those three sectors produce demand for electricity, and there is an electricity module in the EPS that builds and dispatches power plants based on their costs. There's also a district heat and hydrogen module. District heat is not really used in the US, but in deep decarbonization scenarios, we have the ability to look at large growth in the consumption of hydrogen and looking at different production pathways for that hydrogen demand. We also have a carbon capture and sequestration module that allows for the capture and sequestration of CO2 from industry and electricity. We have a fuels module where fuel prices, taxes, and heat contents and emissions intensities are defined. We have a research and development module that lets users evaluate impacts to capital costs or efficiency as a result of R&D breakthroughs and how that affects technology deployment. We also have a land use sector where we track emissions from land use change, and forestry. There's lots of different outputs from the model, but one of the major ones is pollutants. The model has 12 different pollutants, 4 greenhouse gases, including CO2, methane, N2O, and F gases, 4 types of particulates, PM2.5, PM10, black carbon, and organic carbon. and 4 aerosols, SOx, NOx, VOCs, and carbon monoxide. The model also tracks cash flows. So who pays whom more or less in response to a policy, changes in capital spending, operating and maintenance expenditures, and fuel. From pollutants, we also can estimate health outcomes, and we'll get into this more in a bit. Here we are looking at, for example, changes in premature mortality, as well as changes in a bunch of different morbidity outcomes, including, for example, avoided asthma attacks, avoided lost work days, et cetera. And the cash flows are fed now into an input-output model that's embedded within the new version of the EPS that allows us to estimate the jobs and GDP impacts of policy scenarios. So I won't go into all of this, but the model is heavily subdivided by sector. So for example, in buildings, we have 6 different end uses across 3 different building types, and each of those end uses has up to 9 different fuels that can be used. Industry is broken out into 7 specific industry categories and 1 other industry category. And again, each of these can use up to 9 or so different fuels. We have a lot of different electricity power plant types in the model, which are included here. We also have a lot of detail in the transportation sector. So we track 2 different mode types, passenger and freight. Each one of those has 1 of 6 different vehicle types. So cars and SUVs would be light duty vehicles. Buses, for example, would be heavy duty vehicles. Air, rail, ships, and motorbikes. And we track those in passenger and freight modes. And each one of those can have up to 7 different vehicle technologies that can be used, depending on the technology. I wanted to spend a bit of time discussing how we are calculating jobs and GDP in the new version of the EPS. As of version 3.0 and 3.1, which is released this week, we now have an integrated input-output model. So folks who are familiar with that framework might find this redundant, but it's helpful to walk through exactly how this is working in the model. To start with, we take BAU output by industry. So this is the amount of goods in dollars produced by industries in the US. We then have a policy scenario where we've been layering on policies, and we have the output from industry in that policy scenario. We can use this to estimate the change in direct output by industry. We also have information on industrial inputs and outputs. So for example, for per unit of iron and steel that's produced, what are the inputs to that industry? We use that information to calculate what's called the indirect output by industry. That is the change in outputs from industry that are being supplied as inputs to other industries. Together, that gives us the total change in output by industry. From there, we take information on the share of output that is value added by industry. So in output from different industries, there are different elements that comprise that output. For example, the cost of goods, value added is one of the big categories. And within value added is a percentage of value added that is spent on labor. So if we take the total change in output by industry, the share of output that is value added by industry, and the share of value added that is labor, we can estimate the change in amount spent on labor by industry. We also read in information on the wage rate by industry and information on household and government respending by industry. So when people are re-employed or their wages increase, some of that money is respent in the economy. And we use these 3 things to estimate the total change in direct, indirect, and induced jobs by industry. I'll note that change in output is essentially equivalent to change in GDP. So the same structure here is used to estimate changes in GDP. A note here on how we calculate health impacts. We start with an EPA report on estimated health impacts, looking at different air concentrations under different emissions scenarios. From there, that EPA report converts concentrations to health impacts by looking at the health dose response functions. That report then divides health impacts by the change in emissions that got to that point in the first place to derive a health impact change per ton of emissions change. We then take those multipliers and use them in the energy policy simulator so that we can look at what the health impact change is per ton of emissions change. So again, we're pulling this data directly from an EPA report. The model has been pretty extensively reviewed by a mix of national labs, universities, and our global partners. Every time we build a new model, different pieces of it get a new round of review. And we've been very fortunate to be able to work with folks in each of these institutions to get their feedback and improvements into the model. Turning to the 1.5 scenario, so what 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario means is a wide range depending on which scenario you're looking at, and also, of course, which country you're looking at, with the assumption that developed countries will have to do more than developing countries. We focused on the 3 scenarios from the IPCC's 1.5 degree report that looked at no or limited overshoot. And focused our emissions reductions trying to get within those ranges. So in terms of those ranges, the interquartile ranges and where our modeling is ending up, you can see on the right, we have 2030 and 2050 reductions of CO2 and greenhouse gases. And in 2030, we're towards the upper end in terms of greenhouse gas reductions, and in the middle on CO2 reductions. And by 2050, we're actually exceeding the reductions within the interquartile range, both for CO2 and greenhouse gases. The list of included policies is included here. There are a lot included in the 1.5 scenario, but I thought I would just call attention to some of the largest drivers of emissions reductions. And those are, for example, the clean electricity standard, where we have an 80% CES by 2030 and 100% by 2035. We also have retirement of all coal by 2030. In the building sector, we have a 100% electric new appliance standard in buildings by 2030, so that all newly sold appliances in existing and new buildings are electric by 2030. In the transportation sector, we have a 100% electric vehicle sales standard by 2035, and a similar standard by 2045 for medium and heavy duty trucks, in line with the California standards and the MOU that was signed earlier this year. In industry, we have both energy and non-CO2 policies. So for example, we have 100% achievement of the HFC or F-gas reductions in line with the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. We have 20% fuel shifting by 2030 and 100% by 2050, shifting away from fossil fuels to a mix of electricity and hydrogen, which varies based on industrial potential that we've drawn from a report by Enroads. We have 100% achievement of potential emissions reductions from methane capture and destruction in the natural gas and oil, coal mining, water and waste sectors by 2030. And those potentials are drawn from the IEA. We've assumed that 100% of the new hydrogen demand by 2030 is going to be met with electrolysis. And any residual industrial CO2 emissions, including energy and process emissions, are assumed to be captured with CCS by 2050. We also have a handful of land use and agriculture policies, but we find that the energy sector policies tend to be the largest drivers. So I'm going to flip over to the web tool now to walk through the new features and to explore the 1.5 scenario in a little bit more detail. So the new version of the model is online. You can get there by going to us.energypolicy.solutions. Same address it's always been, but now there's the new version online. And I'm going to click on Enter Simulator. For folks who haven't seen this tool before, just a brief intro here. So when you go into the tool, the first thing you see is this red line here. And you see this is associated with new scenario. And we are looking at emissions of CO2e, so carbon dioxide equivalent, and we're looking at the total, including land use emissions. There are lots and lots of outputs in the model, which you can access through these drop-down menus. So we could look, for example, at different cuts of emissions of CO2e. Maybe we're interested to look at what the different sectors look like. I can click on this drop-down menu, and now I have a graph of total emissions of CO2e by sector. We see land use in the US is negative, it's a net sink. Then we have industry, electricity, transportation, buildings, agriculture, and water and waste, and so on. And we have emissions projections out to 2050. We could also look at things like the electricity sector. This is our forecast of electricity generation, for example, in the business as usual case. We could also look at capacity. We also have information in the transportation sector. So for example, we could look at sales of cars and SUVs by technology type, and we can also look at stock of vehicles. So again, here we're looking at cars and SUVs, but this is stock instead of sales. And we have this information for multiple different vehicle types. We have similar information for industrial fuel use, buildings energy consumption, and so on. The way you interact with the tool primarily is through this menu on the left. And this is where the policies are located in the tool, and they're roughly organized by sector. So for example, in the transportation sector, you have policies like an electric vehicle sales standard, a low carbon fuel standard, a fuel economy standard, and so on. So I'm going to flip back here, and I'm going to start with, just for illustrative purposes, I'm going to put on a $150 per ton carbon tax in the electricity sector. So I'm going to navigate. The carbon tax is stored in the cross-sector menu. I'm going to go to the electricity sector, and whenever you click on a policy, you get this popover panel here. This includes a description of the policy, some very rough guidance for setting values based on what other regions or other reports say are reasonable ranges. There's also a few links here, so I'll come back to this first one in a minute. How to design this policy well takes you to some guidance text we've authored on how these policies should be designed in the real world. And some text here on how the model handles this policy. This will take you to a link describing the methodological underpinning of how this policy is modeled. You can use this slider to set the policy. So I'm going to drag this to 150 and let go. And then the model is going to run in real time and produce results. So now we're looking at a scenario with a $150 per ton carbon tax. Now, by default, this 150 is going to be hit in 2050, and the model is going to phase that in at the same rate every year, but we could change that. So if I click on Customize Implementation Schedule, it takes me to this window. So you can see that we're starting at 0%, and we're hitting that 100%, so what that $150 per ton in 2050. But maybe I want to hit that in 2030. So I can just type in 2030, 100%, hit the plus. Now you can see this graph reanimated and hit OK. And you'll see now that there are deeper emissions reductions in earlier years of the model as we're hitting that $150 per ton earlier than we were otherwise. All the policy settings that you turn on are recorded both in the policy scenario selector. So you can see now it says 150. There's a little clock here, which means that we've customized how it's implemented. It's also recorded down here. So now it says cross-sector carbon tax, electricity sector, $150 per metric ton. And as you add more policies, they'll all be recorded down here. So I'm going to flip over now to a few built-in scenarios. So to start with, the 1.5 pathway is actually built into the model now as a reference scenario. So I'm going to flip over to that. So you can see that in terms of emissions of CO2e, we're getting very steep reductions all the way through 2050, down below 500 million metric tons of CO2e. And if we look at CO2, we're actually net negative by 2050, and we get to net negative right around 2045. Now, there's a couple of important graphs here. So one is this effects by policy wedge diagram. So this actually lets us look at how the different policies are contributing to emissions reductions within this policy package. And everything here is color-coded by sector. So blue here is industry, gold and yellow is electricity, blue, aqua up here is buildings, and red is transportation. So for example, you see the largest dark red wedge here is associated with the EV sales standard. We have a similar set of graphs that we call the abatement cost curve. That is that shows the relative cost effectiveness as well as the abatement potential of policies in this scenario. So for folks who are familiar with the McKinsey cost curves, this looks similar. The main difference here is that these boxes are related to policies, not technologies. But we tend to have similar findings. So for example, we tend to find that efficiency policies are on the left side, the more cost-effective side. So for example, here's vehicle fuel economy standards, industrial energy efficiency standards, and so on. So this graph can help evaluate the relative magnitude of emissions reductions by policy, as well as the cost effectiveness of different policies. Flipping over to some of the new outputs. So the new jobs and GDP outputs are now located here: financial, jobs, GDP, and earnings. You'll notice that this scenario has a lot of job creation. We're looking at close to 7 million new jobs generated in 2050. We've broken those out several ways. So for example, here we have it broken out by fossil fuel and utility jobs, manufacturing and construction jobs, and other jobs, which is a catch-all for all of the rest. I will note that there are many more sectors than just these three bigger buckets in the model. I think we have over 35 different sectors if you wanted to drill down into any one in particular, but for simplicity, we've grouped them here. We also can look at this a few different ways. So for example, we can look at the change in union and non-union jobs. And here we've just assumed today's unionization rates by industry are carried forward into the future. So we're not looking at any change in unionization rate by industry, but we do have this in here so you can look at how the sectors with union jobs grow over time. We also have a breakout here of direct, indirect, and induced changes in jobs. So you heard me mention this briefly when I was describing the input-output methodology, and I'll review that one more time here. So direct jobs and direct changes in GDP are those jobs and changes in output that are a direct result of policy. For example, if I put on a clean electricity standard that causes a lot more solar panels to be installed, the construction jobs involved in building those solar panels, those would be direct jobs. Indirect jobs are those created by the production of inputs to the technologies or equipment that's being deployed. So for example, in this scenario where I have a lot of new solar deployed, there are jobs created in the industries that are creating those solar panels and providing the inputs to those solar panels. Those would all be indirect jobs. And lastly, we have induced jobs. So induced jobs represent the respending of growth in wages or newly employed people. So for example, in this scenario, we would now have a lot more construction workers helping to build and deploy those new solar panels. Those new construction workers would then spend their money in the economy on things like retail and food and so on. And those that respending causes new jobs in those industries, and that's what's being tracked by induced jobs. We also can look just at direct and indirect jobs. If you don't want to look at the induced job effect, we've got just the direct and indirect effects graphed here as well. So you can see, excluding the other ones, we still have, we're peaking out at more than 2 million new jobs added in 2035, and then holding relatively constant around 1.8 million jobs through 2050. We also track the change in GDP. So in this scenario, we're looking at a change of nearly $1.5 trillion in GDP by 2050. And remember, transitioning to a zero carbon economy requires a massive build out of equipment. And so it's not surprising that we see this huge growth in GDP as we need to build and install all of that new equipment to reduce emissions. We can also track this as percent change. So that equivalent growth is equal to roughly a 3.5% change or growth in GDP by 2050. Similarly to how we break out jobs, we can also look at what's driving that change in GDP, again, by direct, indirect, and induced. We also track change in employee compensation. So this is the total change across the economy in the amount spent on wage. In the 1.5 scenario, the total amount spent on labor is growing by about $650 billion per year. And we also look at the change in compensation per employee. So this is change in average annual wage. And in this scenario, we're seeing growth of about $750 per in average wages. This is on top of any inflation that would be contributing to wage growth. And finally, we can also look at the direct, indirect, and induced changes to total spending on labor. So that covers most of the new economic outputs, jobs, GDP, and earnings, but we also have a handful of new health-related outputs, and those can be found here in human health and social benefits. One of these new outputs is the ability to look at which policies are driving the largest change in premature mortality. So previously, we just had a graph that showed total change in premature mortality or premature deaths here. But now we have a wedge diagram, like with the policies, where you can see what's driving that. We have now also a lot of morbidity outcomes. So in addition to premature deaths and monetized avoided deaths and climate benefits, we now track avoided lost work days, avoided respiratory symptoms and bronchitis, avoided asthma attacks, avoided non-fatal heart attacks, avoided hospital admissions, avoided respiratory ER visits, and avoided minor restricted activity days. One last piece here. So with the new features on the input-output model, we can now look at how, in particular, policies that are taxes or subsidies, we can look at how their revenue is reused or raised affects job creation. Down here, there's a section called government revenue accounting. And for each of the tax and subsidy policies, there's a specifically broken out menu. But for example, in the carbon tax revenue, we can decide how that revenue is respent by giving different weightings to these different categories. By default, we've just chosen that a third of the revenue raised goes to reducing the budget deficit. A third of the revenue raised goes to a household tax offset or a household dividend, and a third goes to a payroll tax offset. But you can play with these to get any mix of revenue respending that you want, and you can see what the impact is on jobs. And you can also do the same for subsidy policies. So for example, if you wanted to look at how an EV subsidy would affect jobs, you could look at how the revenue being raised, whether it's coming out of, say, increased household taxes, or if it's just coming out of the deficit. You can see what that does to total jobs in the economy. So with that, I'm going to stop and open it up to questions. Although I think before we do that, we might have a couple of poll questions that Sarah is going to run for everyone.
If everybody wants to take a look at the poll question that should have just appeared on your screen. What clean electricity standard target in 2030 reduces power sector emissions in line with a 1.5 Celsius scenario? Go ahead and just give your best answer, and then Robbie will show you how the tool can help you answer that. All right, looks like we have the results. So Robbie, looks like the winner here is 80%. 58% of people think that it's 80%. And then the runner-up is 85%, and then 75% came in last. So perhaps you can shed some light on that for us.
Yeah, so good guesses. Of course, the answer is it depends, though, on what else is happening in the power sector. So I've put together a couple of examples here that I'll quickly flip over to. So one is a, okay, so I've got pulled up here another 1.5 degree pathway, but I haven't assumed anything about coal retirements here. And so the answer is, it really depends on what you think will happen with coal by 2030. And to give you an example, I will show electricity sector emissions here in two different scenarios. So right now we've got a 1.5 degree pathway with no additional coal retirements. And then I'll add our 1.5 degree pathway that we were just reviewing. And you can see that where you get on power sector emissions depends to a large part on what you determine is going to happen with coal. So in our scenario, we do have 80% clean electricity standard by 2030 and 100% by 2035. But we've also had to assume that the entire coal fleet is retired, or at least not generating by 2030, in order to produce emissions reductions that are in line with a 1.5 degree pathway.
That's great, Robbie. Thank you. And Now we want to facilitate the Q&A. So if you haven't looked at the Q&A box yet, take a look and click on the thumbs up if there's any questions you want to make sure that get answered. So Robbie, one of the top questions is actually about carbon taxes and how the tool can be used to model carbon taxes. So it says, this is from Rick Knight, and he says, your carbon tax can only be entered as a straight line trajectory to a final price, but few carbon tax proposals work that way. Some follow a percent increase trajectory, others have target dependent rate increases. Would it make it more useful to accommodate those kinds of modifications?
It's a great question. So actually, that is something you can do in the tool already. For example, if you wanted to put in an annual growth rate here, sorry, I'm going to flip back here. So you can go to cross sector. Let's just say it's electricity sector, and I'm going to slide this up again. I know that some of the carbon tax proposals that are out there, for example, they start, let's say we wanted to just start at $50 per ton and then scale up. So let's say we're going to start in 2021 and $50 out of 150 is a third. So if I just go in here and in 2021, I want to start it at a third of the setting, I can do that. And then I can go in a straight line to 2050. This policy schedule lets you customize it to your heart's desire. You can change it every single year if you want. You can put in any policy schedule that you want to reflect any of the proposals out there and what they're projecting for carbon tax price.
Thanks, Robbie. There's a couple more questions about carbon taxes. So while we're on the topic, I'm just gonna bring those up. So Rebecca Wigg is asking if there's an option to reinvest the carbon tax revenue into other carbon reducing policies. And then there's another question from Leslie that says, can the carbon tax revenue be set in order to return 100% of the carbon tax to homeowners by setting household taxes to 100%?
So let me answer the second one first, because that's easy. The answer is yes. So this is a little confusing down here, but these are all weights. So an equal weight of 5 in 3 categories just means a third, a third, a third. If I were to set this to, and I actually have, I have one built in here already. So here's a $50 per ton carbon price household dividend. If you just turn off the other ones or set them to 0 essentially and set household taxes to anything, because they're all zeros otherwise, then what you're looking at is a carbon tax that's 100% rebated to households. Sorry, Sarah, can you read the first question one more time?
Absolutely. So that question was, is there an option to reinvest the carbon tax revenue into other carbon reducing policies?
Right. So there's not an easy switch to click that does that for you. However, what we've done in the past is you can look at the amount of money raised through the carbon tax. So in this scenario, and we're looking at a $50 per ton carbon price that's 100% household dividend. You can look at the amount of carbon revenue raised by going to financial policy package costs and savings. And you can see here, if I were, so the tax is being 100% rebated right now. So the size of the revenue from the tax is represented by this green line. You can, if you wanted to look at, for example, let's say you wanted to use the carbon tax revenue to pay for an electric vehicle incentive. What you could do is set the incentive policy such that this green line equals 0. And that way you're taking all of the revenue raised from the policy and you're respending it on other policies. You could do that with multiple policies. Any policy that's using government money to pay for it, like a subsidy, as long as you can get the green line to approach 0, which you're basically looking at as a scenario where you're respending all the carbon tax revenue on other policies.
And I'm going to go ahead and ask another related question from Rob Sargent. Robbie, since we're on the topic, if you wanted to model the benefits of a cap tax fee and invest in solutions versus cap tax fee and dividend the model, how would you do it? Would you assume that revenues go to regular spending and then play with the spending assumptions?
Yes, except instead of regular spending, I would actually say the deficit. So instead of the money just going into the government, because if you do regular spending, what's going to happen is that assumption there is that the government is re-spending any money that comes into it the same way they spend it today. So more money on entitlements and military, for example. If you just look at budget deficit, it's kind of just going into the government as if it were a bank. So if you wanted to look at two, you could look at one where you only have a value here for household taxes. That would be 100% cap and tax and dividend. And then you could look at another scenario where you have 100% going to the budget deficit, and then you're using those other subsidy policies to make this line equal to zero, such that there's like no tax revenue that's not being reused for other policies.
Thanks, Robbie. There's a couple of questions about jobs and GDP output, so I'm going to ask those now. So Joe Ryan wants to know if all the new jobs are net new jobs.
Yes, they are net new jobs. So we track both gains and losses in jobs, and that is particularly important when you're looking, for example, at policies that significantly reduce demand for fossil fuels. You need to make an assumption about what happens to those industries, those being the fossil fuel producing industries in the US. And if you really want to look at economy-wide job changes, you have to fully capture both the gains from deployment of new technologies as well as the losses in jobs, for example, from fossil fuel extraction, refining, and distribution. So this is capturing all net changes in jobs.
Great. And then another question from Rick Knight. Does your jobs and GDP modeling take into account impacts on the dollar value as a consequence of federal deficit changes from a policy?
Yes. So there is not on the online tool, but in the version of Vensim the version of the model in Vensim, we do have accounting for changes in inflation as a result of changes in the deficit and how that money is used. If you have specific questions on that, I would refer you to Jeff Rissman, who's the architect behind the model. He spent quite a bit of time thinking about that, and I'm sure he'd be happy to answer any additional questions.
Great. And then another question from Rick related to GDP is, most other models of aggressive climate policy show either neutral or slightly negative GDP growth impact, but your model shows huge GDP increase. Why?
So actually, I think the premise of that is wrong. There are quite a few models out there, and I'm happy to follow up and provide examples of those that show substantial GDP gains with climate policy. The question in some ways comes down to how you're modeling and what you're assuming about the technologies that are going to be deployed to do that. So there's quite a bit of literature showing actually significant GDP and job potential growth under climate policy, and I think it would be best to share those resources.
Great. And then let's see, a question about, where did it go? This is an interesting one. Can industry and agriculture be analyzed separately now from to-dos? Sorry, that's the name of the person, to-dos.
Yes. So actually, that could always be done in the full version, but we also have agriculture is separately broken out here, and here's industry, and we've actually broken out water and waste as well. And there are distinct policies for each of those sectors, so they're separately broken out from industry. And of course, more detail is in the full version of the tool, which I don't think I mentioned at the outset, but the model is completely free and open source. You can download it, run it, look at all of the input data, change it if you want. The software to run the tool is not proprietary. There's a free version called Vensim Model Reader that you can use. And the model is, one nice thing about Vensim is it's not code, it's all flow diagrams and easier to understand than looking at a model that's all code.
And now we've got a question about health, which is great. So Carl is asking if EPA, so he's saying that the EPA is moving to exclude health benefits from its cost benefit analysis for new rules. And it would be useful to use this tool to fill in the gap in analysis until the new administration can reverse the rule. Have you any plans to use this tool to publicize these benefits?
So we've written about the public health benefits of various energy and climate policies in the past, and as those come up, we love to use this tool to provide that data where it's helpful. I would also just point out there are several existing tools from EPA that folks could use to make that argument themselves in addition to this. So those would include things like a tool called Cobra and a tool called BenMap. Those are actually the tools EPA uses itself to, or used to use itself to estimate the health benefits of its policies. We don't have immediate plans on any specific pieces of regulation at the moment, but we're always interested in producing timely and important analysis using this tool.
And then we've got another question about some of the international models, and wondering if the updates have been provided or going to be integrated into the Latin American and Asian simulators as well and scenarios.
Right. So we work with regional partners on the international developments. So some of those partners are actively engaged with us in updating. For example, we expect an updated India model shortly, and we hope to have an updated China model in the coming year. And we are developing some new models as well. We're currently working on a version for the European Union, for example, that will be built on this platform. But we don't have the bandwidth to do all of that ourselves. So if folks are interested, either as previous partners of ours or as new partners looking to engage on updating the model to integrate these features, we would love to speak more.
Thanks, Robbie. And then Kevin Fox has asked a question from your presentation a little bit earlier in the presentation about the IPCC report, and he says, doesn't the IPCC 1.5 report have more than 3 scenarios with no overshoot, but why were there just 3 in the summary?
I can't explain why the IPCC chose the specific scenarios they did. But they chose to emphasize, chose to bucket, as far as I can tell, into a few different categories. So there are hundreds of different modeling runs that were done, and you can actually access all of those online at a site hosted by YASA. But we used this data from the summary for policymakers as kind of our guiding tool in developing a policy scenario that falls within the ranges outlined by their report.
Thanks, Robbie. That's helpful. Feel free, if you haven't gotten a question yet, to enter that in. We'll be sure to try and address that. Another question kind of about the model and its capabilities. Curtis is asking that the group at MIT has a similar tool called Enroads, and how does the model compare?
Yeah, so we work, we're regularly in touch with the folks at Enroads at MIT who run Enroads, and they have a great model. There's a few differences. So one is Enroads is global in scope and doesn't have specific country detail, whereas the energy policy simulators are developed at the country or even subnational level, like the Virginia Energy Policy Simulator we released this week. Another is that the EPS is really focused on specific policies that policymakers can take. And Enroads is a bit broader in that it kind of looks at much larger assumptions about broad policy categories, like a global carbon tax or a regional carbon tax. The Enroads also has climate impact. So because it's a global model, they're able to look at things like the net impact on CO2 concentrations and sea level rise and warming, whereas the EPS is really focused on energy and emissions, and has the added feature of having that cost and jobs set of outputs as well at the regional level. So I like to think of them as highly complementary. They are directionally consistent, but they're used for slightly different research purposes.
Thanks, Robbie. There's a question from Mark, and I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but I think what you're getting at, Mark, and feel free to clarify in the Q&A box, is when we look at the jobs numbers, are we able to identify the types of jobs that are created, for instance, decreases in fossil jobs and increases in clean energy jobs?
So it depends on the sector. So in the full version of the model, we are using what's called the ISIC codes from the OECD. So in the US, there is more granular data available from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. However, the EPS is an international model, and in the interest of trying to make it more easily scalable to other countries, we've relied on data from the OECD. Now, within that, there are about 30 different or 35 different industry categories, specifically related to utility jobs. The breakdown we can get out of the model are specific jobs related to oil and gas and coal mining and extraction and processing. But we're not able, for example, to drill down into, for example, in the power sector, the loss of jobs, for example, at fossil power plants versus the growth in jobs at clean energy facilities. We can look directly at some of the job impacts from specific power plant types, but we'd have to do a bit more of a detailed analysis. That's just one limitation of using the OECD data set, and more broadly of the limitation globally on sectoral input-output tables.
Thanks, Robbie. We've got still more good questions coming in. One question is from Daniel, and it's asking us why Virginia was recently chosen to release a new model, model.
So as I mentioned, we are in the midst of a partnership with Rocky Mountain Institute to produce, we're aiming for 20 state level energy policy simulators. We are focused on states that are thinking about climate action, that may or may not have already taken some form of that. So for example, Virginia has a landmark policy, the Virginia Clean Economy Act, on the books. We received inbound interest from folks at the DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality in Virginia. So that's what informed our decision to begin with Virginia, but we have 4 of those already in the works. And as I mentioned, we're aiming for 20 by the middle of next year. So there are going to be many, many state versions, hopefully, within the coming months.
And Madhav has a great question too. Is there a plan to publish periodic outputs from this model to inform various stakeholders on how we're progressing?
So the model is forward simulating, and all of the outputs are available online. So the model, when I'm running it, when I'm playing around with it right now, it's actually running in real time. So you can get whatever outputs you want out of the model anytime from the website, us.energypolicy.solutions. We do periodically publish things like research notes, where we're looking at specific topics of interest that might be especially relevant, but we don't regularly publish the results per se because they're all on here already. And when we do have a big model update, we have a big webinar where we invite all of you to join.
And that gives me a good chance to plug signing up for our EPS update. So we'll pop that sign up sheet or the sign up link in the chat, and go ahead and sign up to make sure that you're updated on any releases. So let me see, what other questions do we have here? Okay, Jared has a question about how linear is the model? If I aggregate single policy runs, do I get the aggregate simulation of all the policies?
No. So, and that actually brings up an important point. So one of the real values of the EPS is that it is designed to measure the interactive effects of policies. And so when I'm showing you this wedge chart, for example, this is not actually just taking each individual policy, running it, and then adding it. It's actually looking at the whole package of policies together, and then looking at what happens when you remove policies one at a time. So for example, if with electrification policies, the size of the power sector policy wedges grows significantly because you have a lot more electricity that's being generated. So I would say if that's what your question's getting at, it's not linear at all. It's actually trying to capture all of the policy interactions at once and measure the relative size of a specific policy given all the interactions across different sectors and other policies.
And we're getting close to the end of our time, but I wanted to ask there's just one more question that I wanted to put to you, Robbie, and that is about, let me find it again, I just lost it. What is assumed about the reductions in other countries while you're creating US policy scenarios?
That's a very good question. So essentially, we are not making any assumption. We're actually not even looking at other countries' emissions. We do have a business as usual projection of technology deployment in other countries so that we can estimate the reductions from endogenous learning and policy-driven endogenous learning in the US. But in this model, we're not looking at things that are dependent on global emissions. So for example, we don't have an output of CO2 concentration or warming or sea level rise or anything that would require the emissions data from other countries. We do have that technology representation in some of the input data to try and help us understand how policy-driven changes in deployment of technology can change prices.
Great, thank you so much, Robbie, and thank you everybody who joined us today. As we said, we'll be sending out the recording to everyone, and if you also wanted copies of the slides, just send us an email. So thank you so much, and happy holidays, everyone.